Welcome
All
back to
right.
the Ironsides podcast. I've got Eric Tung in the house of Blue Grit Wellness. What is up, Eric? How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Super good.
Good.
I'm stoked to follow up on. We had a conversation the other day. It was a really good one. I mean, I walked away from it feeling fulfilled, quite frankly,
Oh,
at a lot
wow.
of levels. Just in kind of one, just connecting with a good person, um, somebody who sees things through a similar lens, but also very differently in a lot of ways. And
Yeah.
being able to just have a very open conversation with you, and I'm excited. Uh, I was excited to get on this platform and be able to do that with you and share a conversation with the audience because I really think you can bring some cool stuff to the table. So,
No, I appreciate it.
welcome to
That's
the
all
show, man.
praise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
welcome.
thanks for having me. I'm excited, and yeah, likewise, man. It was awesome to connect beforehand, and then get conversing on my show, and then just a lot of. I mean, I say like a lot of good stuff. No, we're talking about a lot of not great stuff,
Right.
but the good takeaways from that and what we can do to bring to the table.
Yeah, one of the things that I see you bringing to the table, we could talk about, for those people that don't know who you are and kind of what you're doing, and talk about that. But there's a few things that really stood out for me, kind of when I first came across you, and then obviously in our conversation the other day. And there is this, I don't know the word I'm looking for. Actually, it's kind of escaped me, but there's a very calm and collected or calculated approach to
Mm,
the things that you say, how you say them, and the intention that you have or that you keep or project. Let me put it that
sure.
way when you're delivering them. And just letting the cat out of the bag for people that don't know you, as a law enforcement officer and kind of where you are in your career, I find it really refreshing. And I
Mm,
feel like my growing up and just, I wanted to be a cop too. We covered that on your show. I wanted to be a cop too when I was young. And what I saw that there was, I don't want to say a very macho, kind of approach, but it was a very intense kind of approach to policing. I grew up like when my formative years were in the 80s and 90s. I live in the Bay Area. There's a lot of things going on here at the time. I
yeah.
was living in like the one of the top like three safest cities in the United States in San Jose, which was weird because I knew it was happening in areas of the city. I was like, that,
Doesn't feel
that,
safe all the time. Yeah.
yeah, doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And I also knew guys. I had neighbors that were cops, and they were not necessarily the same. They didn't have the same kind of affect you had. So that's kind of how
Mm,
what I grew up, having. And I think a lot of those guys are like kind of timing out now. I
sure.
mean, I'm in my late 40s now, and so those guys that were, my age and going through there, but also their dads that had gone through there, it's definitely a different era. And kind of the message and the way I hear you delivering it now speaks to that, I think. And there's a need for this. So I'm excited to get into today. Um,
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I take so much of that as praise, and I appreciate it. I mean, I had certainly a lot of mentors, a lot of peers, especially in the space. That's what's refreshing is like there's a lot of folks that are first responders, non-first responders, right? Like just that can connect on what we need to talk about. Sometimes that's uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes that's culture and challenging thoughts and challenging thought patterns. I think it's all encompassing that we try to do that in a positive way, and that's really what I try to be about.
yeah, I think sometimes when people maybe look at this from the outside looking in, if they're not used to that or this is different for them, there's questions. They're like, is this dude
Yeah,
for real? Is this honest? Is this
yeah,
genuine?
yeah,
Is it authentic? Kind of all those words come up. But um, I, again, sort of having some interaction with folks, maybe in a different way than maybe a lot of other people do. If you're a police officer, you're having a lot of interaction with other police officers,
hmm,
right? If you're a civilian, you're probably not. And I would ask the question, what kinds of interactions are you having with those police officers, and what kind of ways? I feel fortunate. I know a lot of the guys here, like I have them in all kinds of ways. Sometimes I'm reporting crime. My place gets burglarized. My
yeah,
client stuff gets stolen, something like that. There's something going on in the street. And sometimes it's just, hey man, what's going on? People literally stop, stop the cars and they'll just roll down the window and say, hey man, how are you today? And we'll have that kind of a conversation. And I realize that's very different than a lot of other people. So, again, I think maybe my perspective can be is slightly unique in a way. So whenever I hear um, maybe a similarly unique perspective, and I think again yours is in some ways, or seemingly is, because we don't hear a lot of this like publicly.
yeah. I think that's part of it. Hmm.
Let's talk about it. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about you, man. Catch me up on you, because I don't know actually a lot about you and kind
Yeah.
of your upbringing, where you came from, how you got to where you're at. So you get to start and finish wherever you want, man. Go ahead.
Yeah, man. It is really interesting to hear your take, especially as you're learning about me, right? And how your initial description of me and how I process my thoughts. And I think that's accurate. I think a lot of that comes from me being an introvert. I was super shy growing up. And so that's kind of where I suppose I'll start my story. Super shy, son of uh, immigrant family. My parents came from China and Taiwan, and part of my story that I often reflect on, and I think is relevant to our conversation about you know law, order, society, is both sets of my grandparents fled communist China in the 50s, and so I frequently reflect on how grateful I am to be in this nation, to be born in this nation. I was born in Tennessee. Don't have the accent, but I moved from Memphis when I was roughly 8 to the Pacific Northwest, where I reside now, right, where I'm a cop now. And my upbringing was rather traditional for Asian Americans. It
Okay.
was just a real push for academia, like you gotta, it's bigger and better. And so it's like, the other Chinese American families, like whose kids are doing the best in school,
Mm-hmm.
and Saturdays was going to Chinese school,
Mm-hmm.
learning Mandarin and all that. Luckily, I was able to push back enough after the move. I say luckily and then not so much, right? Like it would be great to be truly bilingual, where I'm just like laughable at best right now.
Okay.
It's bad. It's really bad. So, um, but in any case, I was pushed towards very traditional paths, right? I had medicine and business, computer science in my family. And so those were like the expected paths. And I was a really good kid. I did as I was told. I was super obedient. Like I said, I was shy. And so in doing so, like I tried those paths. I kind of moved towards them, but at the end of the day, all these different things didn't really resonate with me. I did end up getting going at the University of Washington, and that's where I thought I'd be pre med.
Mm-hmm.
But between the weed out chemistry class, like the weed out chemistry class did its job. It
Is that
successfully
biochem?
weeded me out.
Is
It
that
was just
biochem?
chem, like basic
Oh,
chem. It was called 142, but it was just like the introduction to chemistry.
I took it twice, bro.
Oh man, like so like a little deviation, as opposed to by like where I started kind of getting shaky on the academics was I was super great in math. To fulfill stereotypes, right? Um, but I was like 2 years ahead of like where I should have been in math. So we were able to go that far in advance, I suppose, at high school.
Okay.
So I was taking like college level calculus um, earlier in my high school career. But that's when I started getting more into extracurriculars and hanging out with my buddies and doing, albeit like responsible activities. I was running track and cross country and stuff. I wasn't any good, but I just did it to hang out with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
Student government, music, drama, things like that, right? But that's where I'd like really kind of downshifted on academics, and I ended up having to take it again, right, to try to get the college credit. And then I wasn't able to get it, so I didn't actually test in to pass it or I guess I didn't have it satisfied when I went to college. So I had to take it again,
Mm-hmm.
and then I dropped out because my grades were too bad because I wasn't going to class. I was in a fraternity. I was, living life, doing all that stuff. Um, so I had to take it like 4 times basically to get through like the basic calculus that my major later required. But um, all to say, that was kind of me in a nutshell. But when I think about oftentimes, and I've written and spoken on this, my I guess my transition towards law enforcement, a lot of that probably can't comes from just a lack of confidence as a kid. A lot of that was perpetuated by a really tenuous, difficult relationship with my dad,
Okay.
and so trying to reconcile like what I really wanted to do of impact, where I really, you have to face that when you're kind of wrapping up college time. So I was majoring in political science. I figured I would probably use that as an undergrad and come back to school, whether for law or business or something respectable of that nature, right, for my culture.
Gotcha.
But really, being in the U District at that time, which is just north of Seattle or the northern part of Seattle, at the time there was so much crime. There were so many people, homeless people, mentally ill, very very public, kind of brazen, pretty concerning to just your average student walking around. A lot of open air drugs, a lot of property crime. Like my car got broken into like 3 times when I was just running a painting business with this old Toyota pickup. Like
Yeah.
just these like annoying things,
Yep.
and it's certainly not helpful to spend a few $100s when you're trying to pay for housing and all that. So you get frustrated, right? And then I saw how some of my friends and sororities or whatnot would how they'd have to navigate the neighborhood, how they'd have to navigate kind of the world. So you kind of try to walk all your friends home. You try to be vigilant as just like a dude in college with like no training and no real like
Yep.
physical presence. Like I was, pretty. I grew up pretty scrawny, but I was going to the gym with my friends as kind of social hour, but wasn't anything like that I would really write home about or be confident in. But that coupled with things like someone trying to set my fraternity on fire with me in it and some buddies, right? Like
Is that right?
some arsonist that was never caught. And this was not just like an accident. It was like someone poured gasoline all over this couch, pushed it up against the side of our house,
Holy
and we
God.
woke up to the fire alarm. And as you'd imagine, like luckily I hadn't been drinking much, but I was out. Like I was just passed out. I didn't have the sleep issues I have now from first responder work. So fire alarms going off, my buddies like shaking me, like waking me up. And there were like 10 of us in the house, and we had to make sure everyone was out. And half the side of one house like burned, 3 units were totally like ruined,
Wow.
property damage. So it's a bit sobering that like this kind of dynamic exists outside
Almost
of.
normal where you were. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty bad, and it's only gotten worse, in the last 15 to
We're
18
talking
years.
about
But
Seattle.
yeah.
Mhm.
So especially that neighborhood. But in any case, it made me really reflect on like what I wanted to do, and I just wanted to throw myself at public service, and that was police and fire. And so I started studying my ass off and tested my senior year. And at that time, like it was so hard to get into firefighting, and I got like a 93 on my test, not a single interview. I only got one like rejection letter. And then police, it was just like the doors were flinging open
Mhm.
with like a low 80, like a 81 or
Mhm.
82%. So that actually worked out really well. At that time, 2007, there was the first of its kind attrition because largely the baby boomers were leaving.
Mhm.
A lot of the traditional candidates were military that were overseas, deployed in Afghanistan. And essentially, there was just this void where they're like, oh man, we actually have to actually try to recruit cops because the generation prior to me, Generation X and whatnot or prior, they all remember times when there'd be an auditorium of a couple hundred people going for just a couple spots per department.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's when I tested and started learning the process. And then by that summer, I landed at where I now work,
Well, let
Kent,
me
which
let me
is
time you out for
yeah,
a second.
yeah,
Pardon me. Um, let's go back to the sort of the upbringing and the draw to law enforcement. And you mentioned sort of as a challenge to yourself and your confidence. It's interesting going back. I've actually had this conversation on the show before with some friends of mine. One particularly, folks immigrated from Vietnam,
mm,
and talked about very very similarly kind of his upbringing and the kind of keep your head down, don't make any noise, just do these things, don't
yeah,
dishonor your family, don't dishonor your father, right,
mhm,
as a big one. Go to school, get good grades, become a lawyer, a doctor, some type of a CEO of some tech firm or something like that. That was the goal. But then interestingly, as and this would be like second generation or first generation
yeah,
kids in the culture. He explained this interestingly in that as he got into high school, he was starting to do things that were maybe considered a little bit more rebellious.
mhm,
And you mentioned like keeping yourself occupied with sports and athletics, where sometimes they'll drift to other things, cars, skateboards, video games, those kind of things. And that's kind of where you're trying to almost kind of find your identity. I wonder,
yeah,
just with the culture piece, maybe it's that time, but that's when you're growing up. That's yours are your formidable years as a young man, kind of trying to make decisions about who you are and what you really want to do. And there's all these options versus maybe where your folks experience or their folks experience was There aren't options. It is this thing, then the next thing, then the next thing, and you're faced with those options. And while mom and dad are trying to influence these things, you don't necessarily have to do those things. You're learning
Yeah.
that I can do other stuff if I really want to, but it's going to be costly in the sense that my mom and dad are not going to approve. That's a lot of pressure, and I think it's different. It's similar whether it's kind of the way you came up or anybody else for that matter. I think people feel those pressures. I think the interesting thing is when you go to school, where I was kind of listening to you talk about going to college, really running into some challenges there, and those years which are uber important, right? That's when you start to make life changing decisions. You start to see stuff that kind of changes your life or influences you that much greatly or greater.
Hmm.
That you start to drift towards the service piece. You mentioned public service. You said you were seeing all this stuff kind of happening, and it was apparent to you. But what was the draw? Like what pushed you there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that that was maybe a catalyst, right? Seeing all this stuff and experience it firsthand, and kind of the wake up call. Because I grew up in a pretty affluent community, like outside of
Okay.
Seattle. Although things weren't like sunshine and roses at my house, like growing up at times, I think that there was always this draw for service.
Hmm.
I think back to even being exposed to junior ROTC at high school. I was super intrigued by it. It was
Hmm.
pretty goofy kids that got into it, but it really wasn't even supported for my family to do that, right? Because that could be kind of a primer to get into the military, which I also had a strong interest towards learning more about. Even though I was applying to colleges, I was picking up pamphlets and looking into these different programs and looking at what it would take to become an officer, these different paths that I basically had to hide from my mom, right? Um, and at the same time, 9/11 happened when I was in high school, and that was a
Okay.
big, hitter. And I think that's like a lot of folks that get into this type of service work that
Hmm.
that hit them a certain way. And I always wanted to be some part of something bigger. And truly, that's what brought me into the fraternity, was like seeking male role modelship, right, and wanting to be part of a larger group. And when I saw the kind of camaraderie that a lot of those guys had, like I wanted that. Like I wanted these kind of big brothers. I wanted people to learn from, kind of like how to be a man, like whatever that even means. Because I didn't have a sense that I really knew outside of some of my buddies'
Okay.
dads growing up, and I did have good influences, fortunately.
That's interesting. We talk about becoming a man, and these guys are what, 21 years old, 20, 21
Yeah,
years old, or
just
whatever.
kids.
I
Yeah,
mean, if I
yeah.
think back to when I was 20, 21 years old, I was not a man. I mean, I was a grown person, but I had not become a man yet. There was a lot of things I had to go through to get there. Um, but ultimately, again, you go back, you apply for fire, that's not happening. Uh, and then you get into law enforcement. And I heard you, I don't want to say that was self-deprecating, but you did kind of put in there that, look, it was much easier to get into law enforcement than it
Yeah.
was into
Oh, it's
firefighting.
crazy.
Yeah.
I'll inject just because, like, historically, up until only the recent years, like, it was pretty habitual for people, regardless of your background, like, you're military or you're a volunteer firefighter, you went to college, like, you're usually testing for a few years till you figure out the process. You're getting your EMT,
Right.
like I said, volunteer. Like, only recently are they having a struggle recruiting, which is crazy talk, right? But yeah, police, it was, I mean, even with such a lower score, it was much easier for me to navigate that process, even with learning oral boards and the whole process there.
Yeah. Okay. So you get in. Were you prepared for this? When you get in and you go through the academy and whatever, do you feel like you were prepared? What were the big eye opening moments, or what was the realization when you actually got through it?
I mean, yes and no. No, I was learning on the fly as far as like the testing process, because
Yeah.
it's pretty rigid. You have, board interviews with
Yeah.
3 to 6 or 10 people at a table, background check. All this was really intimidating, and that's really where, fast forward. I got involved with our recruiting unit and running that recently, and we try to remove a lot of that stigma. Like we try to just make it super approachable and explain what the steps look like, so there's no guesswork. Let's like remove the mystique. Like it's no secret. Like we just want good people. But anyway, cut back. Uh, yeah, I wasn't really prepared. I think I had all these impressions of what
Hmm.
academy looked like. I do think that they fulfilled a lot of my expectations and stereotypes, as far as the rigidity of
Hmm.
police academy, the militaristic vibes.
Hmm.
I was not prepared in the ways of, uh, I suppose, every nuance, but I was prepared to exceed expectations and succeed. Right? It ultimately, if you have a good attitude and you can be humble and you can have people yell at you, it's not that bad, right? It's
That
a
was my next
game.
question. Yeah, that was
Yeah,
my
it's a
next
game.
question.
It's gotten less rigid here, but I know that most academies across the nation still have some militaristic kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason for this, right?
Yeah,
Understanding rank and file. There has to be structure. There has to be order, and there's a process to getting somebody to realize the things that are important and that they need to know, and they kind of need to be stripped down to basics. And let's work on some fundamentals and work our way up on top, because we're going to be loading a lot of things on you, and you're going to have a high level of responsibility when you get out. This makes sense.
yeah.
Whether you like it or not, it makes perfect sense. What would you say? I mean, and you're not teaching at the academy now, but like, what would you say? Because I hear, let's just say, folks talking about, well, it's not the same. And I heard you say there's been some adjustment. It is different.
Yeah, yeah.
What are those differences in the process, and what are the differences in the people that are within the process now, maybe compared to when you went through from your best, just give me your opinion on that from where you're sitting again.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that stand out for the Washington State Academy is it used to be this militaristic thing, right? You'd be running, you'd be punished with push-ups, you'd be yelled at
Mhm.
and at attention, and you'd be reciting your handcuff serial numbers and the different laws and statutes and definitions, and you'd basically be gigged, right? You'd be examined and inspected for little loose threads on your uniform. And again, there is a purpose to this. Like,
Yep.
there's a purpose why they want you to shine your boots and relentlessly, a little scuff in, during class, you better be fixing it during the break so instructor doesn't see. That's gone. Largely, there's very little physical activity from what I've been told. There's some
Really?
arrest tactics, stuff like that. Yeah, but they're not like running around. That's too injurious potentially. It's a lot more like a campus, like an academic campus, which there's pros to that, right? Uh, and I understand from the outside point of view why the hazing aspect or the impression of, oh, you're hazing them. But at the same time, when you're asked to memorize these things, it is important that you memorize a lot of details, right? When you're asked to stand at attention when an instructor comes down the hallway and you have to post a guard, you're learning hypervigilance. You're learning these things that are going to keep you alive. So I don't want to totally disparage the new model. I think that there's pros and cons. There's probably a way to integrate it if I was put in charge, right? To
Hmm.
to acknowledge some of these skills that you want to build, but at the same time, not be so rigid that people feel uncomfortable to ask questions,
Got it.
because that is a thing that's for me. I think I'm all about building some level of approachability within reason between rank and file so that you can have those conversations that help you advance your mission.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I what you just said there, with regard to Washington and how it operates. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's one academy, there's one state academy in Washington. It doesn't matter what agency you're going through, you go to that academy.
There's one main one. It's
Yeah.
actually now there's two satellites, but it's all overseen to
Okay,
some
gotcha.
degree of the curriculum. Yeah,
So that's different than a lot of places, particularly like
for
here in
sure.
California. Every agency, well, not every, but most have their own academies, or they're sharing an academy with somebody else. So
Yeah.
that is slightly different. Okay, so sorry, I just wanted to kind of get your take on that, because I kind of hear, oh, it's not the same as it was, and the new people coming through, they got it much easier, or they're weaker, or there's the salty dogs that have been in it for 20 years that are going, yeah, it's just never going to be the same, and they're not preparing these people. The reality of it is they're preparing them, they're just doing it in a different way. And I heard what you said there about, like, there's pros and cons to kind of this new method. And I made this is my take on it from the conversations that I've had with you and others. And we're just like, they're still trying to figure it out. They haven't really figured out the formula that works best yet. And we have to go through several academies and iterations of this to find what turns out the best product, while try not lower standards, get a
Hmm.
graduation rate that's satisfactory, gives us a return on our investment, but not just a graduation rate, but equates to performance out there on the street so that we lower our attrition rate. I mean, I've heard I think it's like a 60% dropout or something like that is kind of the average in most academies through the FTO program. So you put somebody all the way through the process, they get into FTO and they still can't make it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that is that's a high number of people. I mean, does that sound right to you?
It's super variable, but historically, I'd say back
Yeah,
in like 2018, I think our local city was cutting about 60% of our recruits in field training, right? And those might be higher numbers, but it's going to range between 30 or 40 to 60%, I think, across the nation. And so you still have to recognize, yeah, 30, that's still a ton, right? That's still an extreme failure rate that of investment, and you're paying this person a really decent wage for half a year or more to get to that point, maybe a year before you decide that they can't make probation.
right,
That's a big deal for organization, for taxpayers, all these things. Um, it's tough. It's a tough it's a tough formula to crack because you can have the most impressive candidate show up with really high values, really high standards, and perform swimmingly through the hiring process and even academy. But then sometimes when they hit the street, it does not translate. And I think to your point, like it's going to be a continued work in progress because there's not like one way where you can suss it out. And for us, it's recognizing like we need to slow things down. And if someone takes 6 months to learn something that otherwise takes someone about 5 months, like that's a drop in the bucket. Let's go. And so I think recognizing that cultural shift that
mm,
didn't used to exist is key.
interesting
And
take.
we have retained a lot of really quality people that just took a little bit longer. And that's okay, right? If it's trainable, if they have a good attitude and a good work ethic, you can learn most things, but you can't learn character. And we have had people that we've cut really quick as soon as we found a flaw with their character, even after passing a rigid background check and a polygraph and all these things. Like sometimes you just need time, but someone's true colors will show,
Mm.
and we have no tolerance for that. And we as a profession can't. And it is kind of disheartening to see what kind of standards are being lowered across the nation. I know that there's a strain, a burnout, and
Mhm.
you have so few numbers, but we there are some things that you just can't sacrifice.
It's a really good take, and I think it's an interesting perspective to kind of look at like what might we lower a standard on versus what needs to be held, at, with beyond reproach. Like it cannot be touched, but also recognizing that there are things, and those things can be a bit nuanced. Um, it's just interesting, like when people are getting squeezed, that is
Mhm.
departments, cities, budgets, those kinds of things are being squeezed, how those things can be manipulated. But here's the other thing that I hear, a lot of cops saying, those that have been on for a lot of years, like, look, we had all the same problems, 20 years ago. This is not a new issue. It's just
Sure.
we're dealing with it slightly differently than we did. Doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just it's different. But the issues, character issues, right? Passing standards. Those are problems that have always existed, or challenges that have always existed. We just have to deal with it in a different way. Um,
Yeah, and I'll cut in because even with that, it reminds me to a point I was thinking of earlier when you were talking about the newer soft generation. Like that's always been a thing, and I actually I put that in messaging. I wrote that in a police article, but because that's always been a thing. Like when I came in, I remember everyone was counting out my generation, but then when I asked the older older folks, like they were told the same thing by their
yeah.
older generation, and I actually reheard it in just a general podcast that was not about policing or anything. They were just talking about there's always been that generational perception.
Mhm.
It's been a thing. Like we had it harder, and yeah, maybe the greatest generation is the greatest generation. I'll give them that. But since then, like maybe it's always going to be a thing. So rather than hyperfixating or just whining about it, like what are we going to do to bridge communication or see
Mhm.
in a similar vein, right? Because ultimately we have a team with the most generations ever, right? So we got to make it work with what we have.
You know what? I never looked at it like that. Like the current team is the most intermixed intermixing of generations we've ever seen. That's gonna create challenge in and of itself. I hadn't really looked at it that way. Cool perspective, actually. I'll have to marinate on that a little bit. But
Hmm.
Let's talk about your life as a cop and kind of what you've done, what you're doing now, kind of get us up to speed. So, does it start like everybody else, and you go on your FTO problem, spend a couple months, and then you're working nights, or what's going on?
Yeah, so you're going through different field trainers. It's pretty standard where you go through a
Yep.
handful, and I went through four. And that's kind of the standard thing, right? And when you are basically, crawling, walking, running. So your field trainer should be doing less and less as you go until you're solo or you're kind of shadowed. They just watch you and then check you off. And then you're solo. So you're just doing the thing as like in kind of a crazy way, this crazy amount of responsibility and power as for me, a 22-year-old,
That's what I was
which is,
talking about before, man. Like
yeah.
you talking about becoming a man. Like there's a lot there, man. There's some serious
Mhm.
weight in what you just said, and turning people out onto the street with all this responsibility that's given to them and expected of them. Can you talk about that process and then just kind of that transition into doing it on your own? What was the scariest things? What were the most satisfying things?
Yeah, I mean, my reflection would totally vary if you asked me then, asked me now. So coming out of hiring most recently before my promotion was I have a very high scrutiny against younger individuals, called ageist whatever, but especially young men. Like we're not nearly as developed as young women, and there's science behind that.
You
But
mean like
even for my
psychologically and emotionally?
yeah,
Yeah.
like cognitive development, yeah, like
Yeah.
insurance companies know it well, right? You look at uh, car insurance, but yeah, no, truly, I look back and I was like, man, I was like a boy in in a male,
Mhm.
an adult body. Um, but truly, even then, I was a super responsible, responsive young man. Like I was really diligent, I was hardworking, but I was really impressionable. But that could be good ways, that could be not so good ways, and I've reflected on that a lot in how I discuss policing and leadership and being transparent and being accountable to yourself and what culture you're contributing towards and what culture you're receiving. But yeah, it was a dive in, right? I like I said, I grew up in a pretty affluent suburb. However, my first exposure to crime and some of this like kind of discord was in college. But where I started working is a really mixed socioeconomics, high crime, decent gang influence, a lot of drugs. And so that's what led me to choose that city. I had other offers on the table, but I
Mhm.
wanted the real thing. Like I wanted to prove I could do the real thing, not just be, in a pretty chill, affluent, safe area, because I had that option on the table. But I was thrust into that, and there was a huge learning curve. It was a huge culture shock in a lot of ways, seeing how people live, seeing what people have to struggle with,
Right.
and not to sound disparaging, but there was parts of me that was like, I've never been in a trailer park before. This is very eye opening. And then there are calls that I go to or domestic situations where I was like, this is like Jerry Springer level. And
Mhm.
again, not to disparage it, but I did not think that people could really have these types of complicated, I suppose, family or relational dynamics, if you want to
Just like
call it
on
that.
TV. Yeah.
Just like on TV. And I thought it was all like scripted because, you always have that debate. I was like, no, this is a real thing. This level of drama is a real thing for some folks. So, yeah, I'll just say huge culture shock in a lot of ways. Decent culture shock to law enforcement. Like really didn't know anyone that was a cop. Um, Definitely not until I got working with people and got to make some friends. But I didn't know anyone from prior. I had no family or close friends that were in law enforcement.
I think this is interesting. Again, I have not had anybody on, I don't think yet. Maybe the 9 millimeter Musashi, because he was
Mhm.
not prior law enforcement, but there was
True, yeah.
military there.
I'll say he has some
Yeah.
military, which
Yep.
which has a lot of carryover in
Yep.
types, elements of culture. Yeah.
Yeah, but I haven't talked to anybody that's really like kind of come out of. I don't mean to say this like in a disparaging way or minimize, your journey at all, but kind of come out of nowhere into
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
right? And like with zero experience, no friends, no influence outside of. Look, I'm seeing these things happen around me, and these other things are happening in my life, and I'm trying to find my way, who I am, where I can contribute. And so you choose law enforcement with nobody's been there to tell you the stories. You've not been to jail, right? Or at least you didn't say that. Like, I don't know,
No,
maybe you had. Like you hadn't had any
I've been in
run-ins
the
with.
back of a cop car, but
Yeah.
not but that was out of a scavenger hunt, right, with a friendly neighborhood cop that let me do it.
Oh, is that
I
right?
got contacted by the police a couple times, traffic stuff or lighting off fireworks, but that's what happens when you're in the town of Bellevue,
Yeah.
growing up. For those locals that are like, "Yeah, Bellevue." But yeah, nothing crazy.
Yeah, so it's interesting to kind of hear your take on this and just kind of the realities of like, shit, I've never been in a trailer park before. This is wild.
Mhm,
Like, and
mhm,
it's literally an episode of Jerry Springer happening in a trailer park, just like could imagine it would happen on TV or in a movie. So I don't think I've ever had that conversation sort of live with somebody like that before. How are you packing this stuff up and taking it home at the end of the day? Are you just kind of like, well, that was weird, and moving on to the next thing? Or is it something that you're stuffing in a backpack or in a box that you're maybe challenged with or examining in a different way? Because I think this kind of leads back to how I opened this up with how you handle things.
mhm.
So I'm curious about this.
Yeah, early on, I don't think I had a lot of mechanisms, like healthy mechanisms for that. I would share stories, and it became like, oh, what fun stories does Eric have?
Right.
For my college buddies,
Right.
and sometimes that got to be annoying, right? Because it's like, well, I'm also like a person just living life, and that is a pretty good pet peeve for a lot of cops in their non-cop circles of like, oh, have you shot anybody yet?
Oh
And
God.
like,
Yeah.
what's the craziest thing you ever seen? But for a while, like, I was asked what one of my first calls was. It might have been the first call, but it was certainly the first day. But it was responding to a report of a domestic involving two elderly people. And one had dementia and got super confused and pushed, I forget whether it was the husband or the wife, right? Pushed the other. And then someone's head got split open. Like, that's a super just sad situation, right? There's no crime. Someone is, afflicted with dementia, which is probably like the saddest
It's
thing
awful.
outside of stuff happening to kids, right? Like a lot of people know someone in their family or close to, right? Like that's not a cool story.
It's the other
And
side of
it's super
that
sad.
spectrum. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
absolutely. So it's every range from that, and then you do have calls with kids, and you have kids that just are running away, and they're running away so much that the parents don't even call back to remove them or add them to the system, or then you have the parents that just don't care, don't seem to care, and that's super sad, right? um how was I packing it away? I suppose I was just kind of letting it sit out, right? Like, I don't even know that I was stowing it anywhere. I wasn't really someone that was bottling things up,
Okay.
but I wasn't really very expressive with my emotions as a kid. If anything, I was decently emotional, but it was something that was discouraged from my dad, but then, it wasn't necessarily encouraged by my mom. Like, she was very supportive, but I think there's a part of her that worried, like, I don't know, like, are guys supposed to be sensitive? Are boys supposed to be emotional?
Yeah, I think this goes back to like I don't want my son to be perceived as weak, and that's coming from both mother and father, probably,
Yeah.
just in
Mm.
different ways, looking at it through a different lens. Dad recognizes the realities of what a weak man will face in life, particularly probably through the hardships that his family suffered, coming from where they came from and all those other things. Mom, the same way, but also just not wanting her son to get hurt, in life
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever else.
Moms are moms, yeah,
Yeah.
and so
God
and I
bless
don't
them.
blame either one of them. Like,
Right.
for years and years, I was so mad at I was so angry with my dad, and we reconciled before he passed, but, uh, yeah, I didn't talk to him for, like, 9 years, but what's interesting to me, and I still have to unpack this a bit, but a lot of why I wanted to do what I want to do and how I want to be a confident man, and that is to be strong, and that's to be physically strong and emotionally strong and capable, but with that comes vulnerability, and with that comes courage to talk about your feelings. And what I do on my platform a lot is to normalize and defeat these stigmas around talking about mental health, right? So, not to deviate too much, but when I think about that, I actually recognize that I have an intolerance and an aversion to a lot of traditional Asian culture, which is to not just subdue that, but I also see what I perceive as meekness in how people don't stand up for their values, how they
Yep.
don't raise their hand or their voice. And I understand how there could be dynamics with government overthrows, and there's that saying, right? The Western saying of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and there's also an Eastern saying that says the noisy duck gets shot. And I
Hmm.
think about that a lot, about like my upbringing, and maybe like the subtle or overt lessons that my family tried to teach me. So when you analyze like how I conduct myself, or maybe how I may internalize or try to process some of my
Yeah.
thoughts, I think it's kind of a mesh of the two. Um, I've been, I don't know if accused is the right word. Someone brought up that normally they find someone that pauses when they speak to be disingenuous because they're not just overtly saying what they say. But for me, it is processing my thoughts, trying to be diplomatic and then effective in what I say because I have to be mindful of my audience.
So that is what I was referencing earlier today. And I'm so glad you brought that up. That is a very interesting way of looking at it. You're right. And I guess you're right. I have heard that before. When somebody is taking long pauses in their conversation, it's disingenuous. That means the conversation is disingenuous, that they're overthinking and trying to maybe skirt around issues. And in the process of interrogation and things like that, I'm sure you've learned and kind of deal with this on a regular basis too. What's up with the pause? Why the
Hmm.
uncomfortable silence? Or whatever else. So I think it can be misconstrued as, again, disingenuous versus being um, very thoughtful. And being thoughtful is not necessarily cool.
Hmm.
People want more assertiveness. They want more macho. They want more whatever the fuck masculinity.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to put it. They want to attach words. All of those things are good. Can be good things, but they can also be looked at as very bad things and villainized at some level. So that's interesting because that's what I hear and see you doing. I mean, I listen to you talk. I've listened to your podcast, and it is very controlled, and I think that intimidates people a lot of times. I wonder how this has played out for you as a police officer in the different environments that you have to shift in on a daily basis. So that would be like at the department with your peers, at the department with senior leadership, out on the street with your peers, out on the street with citizens
Hmm.
in time of crisis and time of joy, maybe. I'm sure you don't get a ton of that, but maybe occasionally you return a stolen car or something. I don't know. I'd be pretty happy if you showed up with my car.
Yeah.
But then also, in times of a ton of stress in wild and kind of chaotic environments. That was a lot. Can you speak to that a little bit and just kind of have you been challenged by this? Have you
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
questioned? Do you feel like you may have been misinterpreted and that may have cost you something? What can you tell me about this?
Yeah, sure. It's changed so much through the years. I suppose we were still talking about when I was really new, but when I was new, I was quiet, right? Because I
Keep
didn't
your
want
head
to
down.
make noise. Yeah,
Yeah.
until I got off probation, I started getting snarky in briefing. It was literally like the day I got off probation, where my graveyard sergeant was like, "Tung, you just say something."
He's starting now, yeah.
Yeah, like you're mouthing back, and because it was really familial. It was really jokey and really
Mhm.
sarcastic kind of culture. It wasn't super rigid, like
Okay.
um but it was even what happened was it was graveyard, right? And so we started our shift at 8 p.m. and I'm just sitting there and the sarge is like, Tung, you look tired. Are you with us? Are you awake? And I was like, yes, sir. My eyes just always look like this. And then I just like
Oh,
stared him
you
down,
went
right?
there.
Because yeah. And then so he's the guy that doesn't doesn't stop talking. Like he's a know-it-all. He always has something to say, and everyone else is just like waiting till he's done. But the room erupted, and he was just red faced, just speechless. He's like,
I love
"What
it.
happened?" I was like, "I got off probation, sir. That was yesterday. Here I am." Right, and so people are like, "Okay, cool." Like they got to know me. Um, but yeah, I think that there's so many complicated things. I kind of talked a little bit about culture, and I've spoken about this before. And I was working amongst a decently toxic culture and a negative crew, like not my whole department, but just the work crew, right? Some of them were really get after it, kind of meat eater cops, but then they were really callous and kind of catabolic towards other officers that weren't their clique. And some of them have really circled around, and I've even talked to individuals about like, hey, remember that time in your career and my career, like we're kind of a holes, right? And I talk about that because we need to talk about it because there's a lot of cops that are a-holes. And this is not like as character things. Yeah, we know that there's bad cops. We hear about it, we
Yep.
read about it. No one hates bad cops more than other cops. But I'm just saying like we show up sometimes in not a great way because we're not handling our stress well. And that's what I largely equate it to. We don't have the right mechanisms to the things you're speaking of, right? So I handle Blue Grit Wellness. A lot of that was born out of making mistakes, right? Making mistakes with my own emotional health, with my mental health, bottling things up, lashing out. So Have I lashed out at bosses? Yeah. Have I lashed out at citizens? Yeah. Is it okay? No. Like it's not. It's not effective to anything. Like it made me feel better in the moment, and then worse because I got some ratification for it, right? Or I realized that, oh, I'm actually driving a bigger wedge between
Mm.
me and this cop hater community member. I mean, maybe I'll never change his or her mind, but showing up the way I did, I'm
Yep.
kind of cementing that, right? Like I'm fulfilling a stereotype because I mouthed back or I said something snarky. Maybe it wasn't even something that, I could get disciplined for, but just because I was so clever with my words, right? I felt really good. My buddies thought it was funny, but that person feels disparaged, right? And she just, yeah, you just fulfilled that stereotype. So it's not to say like everyone doesn't have their bad day or days, but I've seen that and I reflect that the times when I can bottle it up, like just for a moment, right? All right, take a breath. I'm the freaking professional that's making a good amount of money and I choose to be here. I'm not a victim to this circumstance.
Mm.
That flip happens a lot easier when you're taking care of everything else. When you think about your family, when you think about what you're doing this for, when you're working out, when you're sleeping. And I've had atrocious sleep working on nights. And so really again, going back to the social media was post 2020 when I was just trying to be positive in the space and be public as a cop and start by sharing just little health anecdotes, right? Workout stuff, nutrition stuff, all of which I learned in the job by virtue of wanting to be more effective in the job. None of it did I really grow up around, but it was just my own trial and error and my own kind of self taught nature and gleaming things from podcasts, YouTube articles, right? Like muscle and fitness, men's health, all this stuff like conglomerating into kind of that level of what worked for me in this high stress job.
I think so. You just mentioned a lot of things, just podcasts, magazines, that kind of stuff, whatever, articles,
Yeah.
magazines. I don't know. Do people still read those?
Back
I don't
when,
know.
yeah, well, I mean, at a time, right? Like you're getting men's health and like,
Right.
muscle magazines, and then it becomes, T Nation,
Yeah.
right? And
Oh, and
yeah,
all great.
but
Yeah.
there's some good stuff in there.
There's a
Yeah.
deep rabbit hole there. That is for
Yeah.
sure. Especially because I was going to ask, like, who's influencing you at this time, and like, kind of where you're getting that. And it sounds like lots of places. It wasn't any
Hmm.
one thing. It wasn't any one incident, or whatever. It's just like I have this drive to be better, and I want to show up a better cop and a better human, on these things, or in my life, and then obviously on the job. Because why? Because you see that the response you get when you show up, when you're positive and physically fit and rested and well fed and hydrated and all of those things, uh and that just is so overwhelming to you, you go, I don't ever want to go back the other way, or is there something else?
Yeah. So I'll even take it back because like what led me to the pursuit of fitness and nutrition was it started with just confidence and cosmetic, right? Like I felt like it would be beneficial to be bigger, stronger, to be more imposing and convey confidence, like officer presence.
Okay.
But then as I got into the job and I enjoyed certain aspects, I thought my analytical nature and being good at bookwork would make me a good detective. But really, where I found my passion was like the chase. And so I wanted to be a canine handler and get the guys that normally get away. And so with that, I was like, man, I need to be as physically fit, and that's in all the ways like quick, endurance, like strong. I got to be able to lift a dog and bound over a fence and be agile, like nimble. And so I started training a different way, and I started training a lot, just again, pretty self taught, and just spending a good hour and an hour and a half just every day in the gym, and then realizing that if I learned more about nutrition, I could do more with what I'm working. And so it was more out of that drive of really feeling confident that I could be my best self and be most effective out there to get the bad dudes. And the bad dudes that normally would get away, like they're pretty convicted, right? They're pretty motivated. And so even though you're tracking through the woods and down a ravine, like you got to be ready for a fight at the end of it. And so a lot of times, like I felt confidence in doing that. And it wasn't necessarily like the recognition of all these health practices came later. I talked about sleep a little bit. My sleep was garbage. I was over caffeinating and working out, like
Hmm.
chugging like a half pot of
Common
coffee to
tale.
get my butt to the gym,
Hmm.
and just like buzzing, and like my eyeballs were probably burning, all this stuff. And then under recovering, and then almost falling asleep on the drive home at the end of the shift and just crashing out like on my mattress as soon as I got home. Like there wasn't that self care balanced approach. But in hindsight, when I did have my health more dialed in, when I had my work life balance more dialed in, less overtime, that's when I can reflect back and say, hey, that's when I was showing up better for
Mhm.
not just at work, but my relationships and my friendships. And even that callous nature that I talked about earlier, like that definitely permeated into my personal life with my girlfriend, with my buddies. And it was that call out really that it wasn't the first time. It took numerous times. So I talk about that and write about that. But it was that call out culture that luckily my people cared enough about me to call me out,
Mhm.
where I had to reflect and say, like, something's not right and something's not going well. And this job is taking its toll. And the stress and
Mhm.
the resilience wasn't there, right? The stress was mounting and it was taking its toll on me.
It's interesting you go back to being self-taught. A couple things popped up for me. That was one of them, and that you were doing some research and you were trying to pull all the pieces together to understand how do I impact my sleep better? How do I impact my workouts, my endurance, my ability, my combatives, my stability, my agility? That's a lot of stuff, man, to balance against life, and all the things that come along with that, as well as all the things that you have to do on the job every day.
Hmm.
And so I have to be honest, like when I kind of stepped into this space, this really comes up for me. I think we were talking about this the other day, kind of went into depth on it. Um, so forgive me if it sounds like a repeat to you, but I don't think these
It would be
listeners
new
haven't
for the
heard it yet.
audience, though. We're good. We're good.
Yeah. So, but when I stepped into the space and I started up my firearms training, I found myself around a lot of law enforcement officers all of a sudden, and I didn't understand that dynamic that I understand the way I understand it now in terms of how much training they do get versus how much training they don't get, and anybody that I was around was out there on their own time and their own dime, and that was actually pretty rare. That's not a big thing. These guys were out looking for answers, and it wasn't just males; there was females there too. To be clear, and they were working hard, and I could tell there was a lack of confidence,
Mm.
and that's why they were there. In some cases, and very rarely, if I'm being honest, did somebody come out where I noticed like they seemed very confident and then quickly were humbled in front of everybody by them, by their peers, either other officers that might be there or just civilians that are there. They're training. They're much better than them with the firearm. I say that to say is they were out searching and trying to become better on their own time. You're taking, you just mentioned the shift work, right? So
Hmm.
you might get a day off, right? You might get 2 days off or whatever. You still got groceries to buy, laundry to do, lawns to mow, family to spend time with, all of those kinds of things. And they're taking time out to go train. So when I was out there and I was with these guys, I was going, man, there's a big gap here between the health and wellness aspect and how much better an officer or human that they could potentially be
Hmm.
if they had some answers, if they had some resources. And so I started searching. I wanted to understand what the resources were and what they weren't. And what I found was a massive gap in what they needed, what they were getting, or what they needed, what they wanted, and what they were actually getting. And when left to their own devices, I'm going to say 90% of the time it wasn't very good. Now, I'm not saying they weren't doing a good job with what they had to work with. I'm
Sure.
just
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
it could have been so much better. And so they're searching around for this program or that program, which turns into program hopping, which turns into confusion about what's
Hmm.
good, what isn't good. On top of you just mentioned a whole list of things. It's interesting you lined them out like that because I've worked with some other guys, and the question comes up like, what are you training? Like, what are the actual things you're doing in the gym or outside the gym, whatever, from a physical fitness, recovery perspective, and and list those things. Now, what are the things that you think are the most important things for the job? And how often are you training those? And those things were at the absolute bottom of the list. They weren't getting trained at all. So, they learn along the way, like, oh shit, I'm not really doing, bench pressing and deadlifting is all fine and good. And it makes me feel good. But how practical is this? And how does it translate to the job that I have to do, running down through the ravine, over the fence with the dog, get into a fight at the end, all of
Hmm.
these things. I'm going down this road because the question is, what resources do police officers, law enforcement officers have now? And I see you're trying to fill that gap for them, but what resources do they have? Where are they going to get their information now that you see? And I'm not even saying this has to be good information. I'm just saying, where do
Yeah.
you see them gravitate towards?
Uh, what resources do they have? Not much, right? And I start by saying, what are they provided? Not much.
Yep.
And there are some agencies that are doing better than others. I think that we're doing okay to better in that we have a group of officers that are trained. We're certified, like with Mike Boyle's,
Yep.
certified
I know
windshield search,
Mike's a
right?
legend. Yep.
Yeah, so like great basis, right? Like I don't love everything. I don't utilize everything, but I learned a ton after being quote unquote self-taught, right? Um, like deadlifting way too much and like adrenal fatigue probably, right? Like you're just doing stuff because
Why?
that's
Yeah.
yeah, well the benefit of being like a grinder is like you get stuff done, but the detriment of being a grinder, it's like not well informed or planned, then you run into a wall and you feel it when you do.
Yep.
Um, so in that we provide that, our chief wanted a new gym and wanted us to be able to work out on duty. And it's super busy, so not everyone does, but they're allowed to. And more days than not, someone can get in something, right? So you have mechanisms like that and resources like that. There are some agencies that are trying to get partnerships with like meal prep agencies, right? Like, so they can buy a bunch of food, or maybe the officers can pay for it and get food delivered. Like, I think that's kind of the next level to address some of the shift work and some of the
Hmm.
compounding logistics, right? But as far as like going back to me, like I was just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall. And luckily, I didn't get more hurt than I did at times, like with my own like kind of
Mm.
ad hoc programming.
Yep.
But at the same time, like I would just, practice like kind of lateral bounds and sticking the lane, like just because I thought it was fun. Like, but do people know to do that or why, right? Like, is there a why? And so to answer that question, I don't think that there's great resources just ad hoc. I do think that, where we need to grow is just introducing like something's better than nothing, because that is truly what we're dealing with,
Yep.
right? Like there are some, and this jogged my memory when you're talking about firearms, right? There's there's a lot of officers that I wager they don't want to get in the gym because it would be shattering to their ego that is already shaky. Like they know they're out of shape. They know they don't train. They know that if they have a fight for their life for their weapon, it might not go great. Their spouses probably know that because they know they're not fit, right? You know. And so I think that that's a big hurdle that's keeping a lot of people away from getting on the mat at all, even if people are trying to invite them in and coax them in. Hey, judgment free zone, trying to put that out, right? But if you're at kind of rock bottom of like the worst health you've been in your whole life, that's and it I don't disparage. I'm trying to relate, and I could see how that could be hard.
Hmm. So when I said there was a couple of things that came up, one was that, and kind of where do you search for the resources? You were sort of self-taught or kind of self-motivated to do that, and sounds like you wound up in the right places at the right time. Mike's a legend. He's been around for very long time, way longer than I have. Uh, but the other part of it is what you just said there in the building the confidence or the lack thereof. And again, that's what I was seeing sort of in the in the environments that I was being exposed to, and I saw this huge gap in the health and wellness piece, huge.
Hmm.
And I was determined. I was like, well, this is where I can contribute, in this
Yeah.
space. And so I'm going to start talking that message and try and lead the horse to water, and talk to them in a way for them to so that they understand. Like, look, I get it if you're not in great shape now, or if you made all these mistakes, or if you're 40 now and you're still trying to do what you were 20 and it ain't working, and you still can't figure out why you're not losing fat, why you're not getting stronger, why you can't recover, because you're not 20 and your life's different and you're a different
Hmm.
person. And here's
Yeah.
some resources. And that was the thing I was taking. But I also saw how tough it was to get them to drink that water, because a lot of times they're overachievers. And so going back to the confidence piece, the second part of this is the overcompensations that happen when that confidence is low or gets shattered. And so I wondered if this ever came up for you, in terms of behaviors, outlets, things like that, like, or what you see as being a detriment. What can you teach people, young officers now, about what to look out for in terms of those overcompensations? And to be clear, I think there's some mental and emotional health stuff that goes along with
Yeah.
this, and
Yep.
so anybody who listens to the show knows my level of advocacy for mental health awareness and suicide prevention for our first responders and members of our military community out there, and people in general.
People in
So
general, yeah.
there's behaviors like alcohol, drugs, sex. They're just poor, risky behaviors that happen. I'm not so much talking about that. I'm talking about the overcompensations that kind of happen on the daily, maybe even on the job, to kind of build that armor of I'm not really that bad. I'm
Yeah.
better than I really am.
And I think that there's a lot of layers. Like when you first started explaining that, I thought about myself and I would recognize I overtrained and there was some psychological armor there. Like
Okay.
I got much more buff. I got much more strong. I had an impressive deadlift. And, like at a time there was a hesitancy and a reluctance to relinquish that, right? Like I'm in my late 30s. I've literally sold plates before I moved house because I knew that these, having 500 pounds of deadlift was not going to aid me in my personal performance and my goals. But I had to force myself out of that and tweak my back a couple times to really have that wake up call where I'm like, I'm not training for sport. I have a job where if I really jack myself up, like I can't do this job. Like I won't be certified to do it. Like what am I doing?
Yeah.
But it felt really good to
Mhm.
deadlift. I think 535 was like like that
It's
felt
so
so good
it's so
because
funny.
who can do that?
I
But
pissed so many
why?
people off on this show, and not necessarily on on the After Dark versions, but on Monday. I've said it on a few shows, and it just drives people bonkers when I say I think one of the most overrated exercises out there is the deadlift. And
Mm,
not that it doesn't provide and can't provide a ton of benefit, but why are you doing it? And what is the risk benefit of
yeah,
doing this? And you
yeah,
just nailed it. Like,
yeah.
does okay, so you got to whatever it was 535. If you got to
Great.
545, does that make you a
No.
faster runner, a better fighter, a more agile cop,
Yeah.
especially if you're in pain, right? And you're all
And
locked
I
up
was
and can't
probably
move.
in pain a lot. Like,
Yeah.
I wasn't like popping, like ibuprofen every day, but there was times where I was like, oh, yeah, I got to take some, right?
Yeah.
And man, like I think about now in my late 30s, have I lost some mass? Sure. Or like lean mass? Maybe. But I feel so much better. Like a couple weeks ago, I went and jogged like 3 miles, but back then I couldn't jog 3 miles without like hurting something, right?
Right.
And just to recognize you're always carrying a constant tension of your lower back, which is already like super susceptible in our job with the gear and sitting in the car. And so,
Facts.
yeah, yeah, blind spots and just ego, for sure, ego, right? And getting to lifting, like that was my good lift, right? I couldn't squat a ton, I couldn't bench press a ton with my long like monkey arms, but deadlift, like the leverages, like worked for my body. So it fed my ego, and so yeah, what are we training for? What is the purpose? For sure, that was one. Um, I think that, to answer your question, for a lot of cops, like where they have the armor is potentially like performance, whatever that means. And for some people, that's just working raw hours. Like they're working so much and they're providing so much money and
Mhm.
value to their family that way, but they're not showing up to their family in other ways, right? They're literally not showing up because they're at work too much. But
Mhm.
they get a pat on the back from the sergeant, like, hey, thanks for coming in. We're short,
Mhm.
productive, right? But some of them, every agency has one or two or many, but they're working themselves towards an earlier death.
Yep.
The stats are staggering as far as just general law enforcement after retirement, like 3 to 5 years, like you're working for all this pension that you're never going to collect. So that's the thing.
It's scary. I have those conversations once a month with somebody who just said, dude just retired. He did 25 years, retired as a sergeant, and he died in like a month,
Hmm.
like after retirement.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a thing.
and when I that's not exaggeration. I'm not embellishing. I'll get a text message from, dude, we lost another one. Dude wasn't out 2 months, right? And he didn't get to enjoy any of the things that he worked so hard to end up enjoying in the end. Not the piece of property he bought in the mountains that he was moving away to retire. Not his grandkids, not his kids, nothing like that. That challenges me. On top of the fact that going back to overcompensations, and I don't want to turn this into this conversation, but the mental health and awareness piece that you cover very quite deeply in your own information you're providing is that just by nature of you being a police officer or first responder, you're 54% more likely to take your own life. If you don't understand that, right, and understand that there is work that you're going to have to put in to overcome that statistic, and you're constantly overcompensating, it's like, I'll just work more, or whatever else, you are setting yourself up for catastrophic failure one way
Mm.
or another, whether that's with your family, whether that's with your finances, whether that's with your life, or whatever else. That's just that number just blows me away, and that's a fact.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can change about that, except how you behave, how you handle yourself, how you prioritize, how you develop your why, and then how you approach it, right? Um, and so, again, going back to your approach, you come across as somebody that's very pragmatic, and I think that's very difficult, likely, for people to to maybe kind of latch on to. And so, let me put myself in a couple positions here. Like, if I'm the person that you just showed up to a call for, I'm a victim, in a property crime or something like that. Um, I get that you're also very intuitive about making sure somebody feels comfortable, but that pragmatic approach to, could maybe be taken as a little rough, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't
Kurt.
know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, for sure.
and then, if I'm on the policing side, and you got somebody that's really amped up about something that just happened, an officer, or just something really, I was very upset, very excited, very stressed, whatever else, and you're coming at them with this kind of cool, calm, pragmatic, very in touch kind of attitude and approach. Is it ever? You ever find that challenging for people?
Yeah, yes and no. So I'll say there are times where like I said, I'm emotional. Although I can put off this like sense of stoicism, like, and I strive for, kind of the philosophical stoic approach, not like to be cold, but to be recognizing and not let my emotions govern
Hmm.
me. That is a goal, but it comes from a basis of being really emotional, right? Like if there's emotional people around me, like if when I was a sergeant and the officers are coming to me like, Sarge, this is messed up, like I tend to be that, yeah, yeah, this is messed up, yeah, I'm marching right to the commander's office, right? Like I'm kind of that guy, but I have to take a pause. Like I kind of force the pause, and now it's become more and more second nature, I suppose.
Gotcha.
um and part of that, like I can, when you give this prompt or this question, I think about what it was like when I was kind of like beating the drum as a sergeant, trying to appeal to certain commanders of like, hey, like this is the status of morale, we need to fix things now. And I see the command response, and it was kind of like, I mean, it is what it is, man. And I felt so dejected, right? And at the same time, you advance, like, I guess, in time in my career. Now I'm the commander, and I hear the sergeants, and I'm recognizing. So I try to validate, and yet I recognize like there's not a whole lot we can do really about something like legislation. We can't, right? We got
Right.
to do our best. So allow that moment to be a venting session or what have you,
Mm.
validation. I'm with you. I agree. All right, now, like, what can we do to support our guys? Because that's really like our locus of control. And I think that just comes with time and recognizing, like, hey, I have been the drum beater too, but that's exhausting. Like, it doesn't get us anywhere, and it's also like kind of emotionally draining. And so, uh, yes, to your answer your question, also, like, have I been that person that's probably generating some level of annoyance because it seems like it's not affecting me? Yeah, but it is. The most sleep I'll lose through the job has been when something terrible has happened to a person, right? The actual literal trauma, um, not to myself so much, because I've been in some situations, but when I've seen something like a true victim or a kid, like, yeah, that's, you lose sleep over that. The other thing I lose sleep over organizationally is when I can't appeal or work through people that work under me, and just trying to,
Talk about that.
yeah. So it's that disconnect of where you see someone's narrative and they're not performing, right? That's the only reason why something's coming to the boss's attention, right? Whether it's an officer to a sergeant, or now I'm a commander, like when someone isn't hitting metrics, like they're not doing their job essentially. And trying to come at it from, my career background, a lot of it was peer support related. So that was always a hat I wore, and trying to be supportive of people and believing truly through my work as a cop, I believe like if you take care of your people, they'll take care of the rest. But when you feel like you're doing that and it's still not enough, like
Yeah.
that's so burning, right? And you're an employer, right? Like you run a
Yep.
team, you run companies, so like you're kind of like, I don't know what to do, but like shake you, like shouldn't it be enough just to give people what they need, give them the support?
Mm.
But ultimately, there are those performers or lack thereof. Every organization has them, right? Cops, military, private sector, you always have them, and it's sad and it's frustrating. But at a certain point, I think as I've gone in more tenure of my job, my profession, like any organization, it's a waste to keep investing any time into those people. Like you kind of just have to cut bait and not to give up on a person because they can flip it, but you give them the rope, they don't want to take it. Cool. Like maybe you set it down, you tie it off, and you go deal with the people that are here and they're invested. And so I think it's a victimhood that is what's so frustrating. How do you work through that?
Yeah, I mean, you just nailed it, and I think that's I love what you just said there about, you give them enough rope to be able to do the right thing or course correct with, but if they can't figure out how to do that, like you said, the tugboat out the out of the
Yeah.
harbor, or
Yeah. They got to grab it.
they
But
keep
like,
running into shit. You got to
yeah.
tie them to the dock for a little
And
while,
there's
man.
a
It's,
lot of,
I have
yeah,
other things to deal with here.
there's a lot of caring people that would probably like, with that metaphor, they'd be like trying to like lasso him or like make some weird hook. Like, no, but like ultimately they're just going to watch it, like the life preserver land right next to them. They're not going to grab it, that's their choice. And so if I think for leaders, if you recognize that you've done that and you're willing to do it, if they come around, then cool. Like you're showing up. But what frustrates me also is in that narrative, I've seen it play out a lot of different ways where that officer, that person, they will inevitably fail and they'll
Mm.
get written up or they'll resign or they'll retire and they'll say, agency never gave an F about me. And then they'll fulfill someone else's narrative, right?
And their
Uh,
own prophecy.
yes, self
Yeah.
fulfilling. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's frustrating, and I'm really glad to hear you talk about that because when I talk the cops I talk to are good cops, right? Like, and you just mentioned like nobody hates a bad cop worse than a good cop, right?
Mm,
But the cops I talk to are great cops, and they most of them are pretty well put together, kind of in terms of looking at the larger scope of how to deal with things like this. But they are all frustrated by the person that just can't seem to get their shit together and is not trying to.
mhm.
And it's that person that they focus on quite frequently, or for lots of reasons, because it gets them in trouble. They make the department look bad, they make their unit look bad, or whatever else. And I think so. I think that's an interesting perspective of there's still other, if we're talking 10 guys, right? And there's one guy that's being a dick or an idiot, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
you know, use that same energy and focus it on the other 9 guys, right? Not on that dude. And that might sound very idealistic. Scott, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You don't know what we do out here every day, whatever else. Now you're right, I don't. But I'm also not going to accept that excuse that you don't have
Mhm.
the choice to redirect that energy, to the people that do care. And this is from, the unit that's on the street, the team that you may be, or the shift that you might be working with, or from leadership down, or from bottom up. I think that is a huge. You mentioned the word victimhood, which is a big piece of this, and that is it's really really easy to take that road, and I think a lot of people have, and they do, and I think when we look at kind of the state of law enforcement right now, as hard as it is, man, it just makes that victimhood piece so much easier to grab onto.
Yeah.
And not everybody's doing that, but there's certainly quite a few of them. And if you don't think that's going to trickle over like into the streets with the real victims out there, or citizens out there, or whoever else, like that just doesn't make a lot of good logical sense. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear that perspective, and the realness in it. Like, we can't save everybody, and I'm not going to try to. We have things that were within our circle of influence and things that aren't. And if this person doesn't want to be influenced, I can't keep beating that. It's the hammer and the nail, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
law enforcement is the hammer almost every time, right? So it's going to come over the top, and it's going to hammer it until it's fixed. And when that doesn't work, I can see where that could be very frustrating from the inside out. That brings up a question, sort of just kind of another question here is like, in terms of your career path, you've mentioned a few things. cop on the street, obviously. You mentioned being a sergeant, and now you're currently in the role of a commander.
Yep.
Can you kind of talk about that structure and your challenges, like, and how maybe how your perspective has changed as you've gone through there? I mean, I think you've given us a lot of insight to
Yeah.
your perspective, but like, what were the major points between, like, all right, going from patrol to being, or being on patrol as an officer to being a sergeant, kind of seeing things, maybe getting a little bit of a different mind frame or mindset to now being a commander, looking down, uh, down, back down, and also looking up. Can you
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think anyone can relate when they've worked in the industry long enough, but as an officer, you're in control of you, right? And you have pure I do try to encourage like pure leadership, line level leadership. That's huge. Like your influence, even though sometimes it's informal, can be so huge. But when I was an officer, at least I didn't recognize the true potential of that, right? So a lot later, I try to encourage that largely because I didn't recognize it, right? When we talk about culture, we talk about morale.
Mhm.
What everyone brings to the table that day contributes a large portion of that, right? It does feel like negative energy is so much more toxic and cancerous, right? Like it spreads easier than positivity, but we still gotta maybe we have to compensate and like over inject the positivity if we can.
I think it
But
just needs to be nurtured is the word that I use.
mm,
Like, once you
yeah,
got it, like, you gotta just nurture it and cultivate it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like garden, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest thing as an officer, like you're in the mix, and some people love that work. Like they don't want to get into supervising. They love doing the cases or they love just doing like the hands-on approach. For sergeant, it became okay, like now I got responsibility. And I recently heard this. Where was it? But anyway, it was, the Spider-Man quote, right? Like Uncle Ben says, like, with great power comes great
Mhm.
responsibility. Um, but then it's flipped, and you could look at it like with great responsibility comes great power, right? So like you can embrace that. And so a couple things I think come out to me when I think about when I became a new sergeant. One was trying to make people happy, right? Like trying to make everyone like same teamness. But again, what like we just talked about, some people don't want to get on board. And so for sure that was just a learning curve for me and finding my own rhythm and confidence in being an official leader, especially being a pretty young sergeant. But with that is like this heightened responsibility where I felt, even before I was a parent, I felt like these were my kids. And then once I had actual young officers, it did feel like they were my kids. And
Mhm.
I think as a sergeant, I remember feeling so much like, okay, I got time with them every day. I'm going to make value of it, training, what have you, meaningful conversations, critiques, what all this feedback, right? Ultimately, when they're going to that hot call, and I know I'm probably going to be one of the later people there, just by proximity and distance, like I have to trust, like Jesus take the wheel, like they got to know what to do because of what they've been working on their whole career, but also hopefully I've injected some positive things that'll keep them safe, keep the community safe, have us affect a positive situation, right? And so that was a release that I needed to recognize. And
Mhm.
that was hard at times, right? Like, cause I kind of wanted to be there all the time and kind of like a helicopter parent. Um, but yeah, I think I said a little bit before where when you're a sergeant, or at least for me, when I was a sergeant, I kept looking up for all these solutions. Whereas I didn't recognize until later, in my sergeanthood, I suppose, that I just needed to focus on what I could.
Right.
And I think I did that out of resignation of like, well, it's on me to do what I can with wellness as the peer support sergeant, what have you. I can use my relationships to build these bridges and get this positive momentum going as best as I could. But truly, like looking back, like that's what I should have done in the beginning.
Mhm.
And I also was blind to efforts that were above my grade because no one needed to tell me what was going on or that they cared, right? They probably, some of them might have had the wisdom and the insight to be like, okay, cool, like Tung's getting mad, but he's getting mobilized, and I'm going to let him just kind of sit there
Let 'em do
because I see what he's doing. Yeah.
Mhm.
And maybe they nudged me in some way or another that I didn't even pick up on. And I think that that's what I'm kind of where I'll gravitate towards now, like being a commander only for a few months. But I see that, like, I see my sergeants come to me with these very valid concerns. And I'm like, yep, I've been there. I feel that. I, and I And I want to caution because, yeah, if I say like, well, there's nothing I can do to affect it,
Right.
and people are like, of course you can't, because now you're
Right. Now you're
admin,
just
right?
another one of them. Yep.
Yeah, but what I try to say and actually try is like, hey, here's what I can think of off the cuff. I can pass this information up, and I can have a conversation. I can reach out to that other entity that isn't anything to do with police, right? It's just another agency that I have no control over. Like, let's be honest, like our power doesn't extend past our department, right?
Right.
So, and my rank structure, but I can have the conversation. But usually that helps them feel validated, and maybe they circle back. Maybe I do have a positive interaction with some representative from said agency.
Hmm.
Likely historically not, and nothing really changes in that degree. But at least it was a conversation where I gave them the time, I gave them the attention, and then we brought it back to like our locus of control, what we could focus on. And I mean, essentially for outsiders, like commander is very similar. Like, for us, it's sergeant, then commander. We don't have corporals. And what you call it is varied. Like some people have lieutenants, but it's essentially mid management. And
Got it.
so there's a joke that mid management has actually like no power and maybe arguably less than the sergeants. Uh, but I think, yeah, we all have a link of the chain and we all have a seat and a part to play.
I think it's interesting. You're kind of walking me through the hearing them out, sort of fulfilling their personal needs. Their emotional needs in that respect, if you will. Just like, hey, I hear you, and I'm frustrated too because I know exactly what that's like. Showing some understanding, trying to understand the concern, but also explain it back to them in a way like, hey, I guess I get where you're coming from. You understand how this works. As a sergeant, you've been here, you've done this. This is what I can do. I don't have an answer to solve this problem, but this is what I can attempt, and I'll get back to you. It's interesting. I mean, to me, that sounds like law enforcement on the street with the victim who just had, their house burglarized or whatever.
Yeah,
Look, I'm
yeah,
going to take a report. This is how the process works. But first, I'm so sorry this happened to you. This sucks. I
yeah,
had my car broken into 3 times in a matter of a couple of months. When I was in college, I remember how frustrated I was. That kind of simple conversation, right? And then trying to find a solution to the problem, but also being very honest about, where the power lies and where it extends and where it doesn't. So that you're not passing the buck. Again, saying what you said there about like there's nothing I can do, about this. That's probably the worst thing you could say,
right.
especially when that's the truth. Like, I'm not saying don't lie. I'm not saying lie to the person. But just go, hey, listen, you know where this will go, but here's some
Mhm,
things we can try, right?
mhm.
And I will make the commitment to at least doing that, to maybe see if we can get somewhere with this. Because if what you want me to do is make this all go away or make it all better, I can't do that.
Mhm.
You know,
Or, even to add on to that, you ask them like, "Hey, what do you think would help this situation?"
yeah.
Right?
What do you really
You
want
give
out of
them
this?
yeah,
Yeah,
you give them the voice and some of the onus, right? Just like you said, "Hey, bring me some of the solution," right? Let's talk about it. So, okay, you're not happy with what this agency did, or you're not happy with what this boss said. Like, what do you think would work? What conversation would you suggest I lead with? And they might say like, "Well, it won't change anything." And maybe they go there, right? And so at least you can have the discussion and come up with something.
yeah. I know
And
it really is. I mean, it's communication skills, but it's again. I think I want to relate to the being in charge of a team, having a business. There is skin in that game. You do feel a sense of responsibility and accountability to it. And I think if you're leading in with that and you lean into that more, these conversations actually aren't that tough to have. They may not be comfortable, but they're not really tough to have. And I think there's just been a lot less of that. And I guess just in general across people, society, humans, we just don't have these conversations. It's in an email or it's in a freaking tweet or,
Mhm,
whatever else or a DM where we're having these things that should go a little bit deeper, where they should be more human to human. And that's where as the humans like yourself kind of graduate through the process of leadership and career, going back to what you were saying before, with all these different generations that are kind of mixed in there, that culture, it has to start with probably like at the sergeant level, right? And kind of then migrate up and influence down, so that you can you can be in a better position where your street cop trusts your commander that he's doing the right thing, and that they are connected at some level. I don't know. That's just my 2 cents in the whole thing. I don't know how you see it, but when I look at it out there and I see so many of my frustrated friends that wear the uniform and the badge, um, that a lot of them feel, what I can see is just frustration,
Hmm.
and frustration mixed with maybe it's a little bit of, oh God, I don't know. I used this word the other day. I think it's the right word. They're like demoralized.
Yeah.
Because as a leader, if you can't come up with an answer for your people, if you can't come up with one for your citizen that just keeps getting victimized by the same people or groups of people over and over again, I can imagine where that demoralization starts to stack up. And a lot of what you talk about is the truths. When I go back to Blue Grit and the stuff that you're doing there, I hear you talking about the truths, and I hear you talking about sort of kind of some workarounds. And what you do a really good job of is just kind of pulling the pieces out of it and looking at it. First of all, we have to look at the bigger picture, but also like what are the smaller pieces within that bigger picture, and kind of how to approach problem solving, or making it better, or just trying to influence it maybe in a different way. So I'm curious, like, maybe you could just kind of let the audience know, like, what's going on with Blue Grit. What is it? How is it going? What do you want people to take away from it or know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, man. So where I started, like I said, was more towards health, like the obvious aspects of health, fitness, nutrition, things I was really interested in. And then it bled into, talking about sleep, right? Because that was just something I learned about. But as I continued on, right, this was essentially trying to be positive platform for law enforcement, for just tips, but then also introduce some of this behind the badge notion, right? A little bit of like the humanization, because I shared anecdotes of how frustrated I felt like post Floyd, and I spoke to a lot of officers, right? And so publicly, it gave a lot of officers confidence that someone was saying these things, that like, hey, we feel dejected too, we feel demoralized too, but the majority of us are still here.
Hmm.
A lot of our friends are leaving or have left. We don't blame them, but we're here, and we're going to do the best damn job we can, right? And so just to try to project this positive image, try to invite conversation, right, to bridge, not be defensive. So it's been multi-pronged, but essentially, one, like, my motto is better cops, better community, because we are one and the same. We are of the community, and we don't know how long we have in this job, right? So if it's an unhealthy lifestyle and you retire and you croak the next month, there's like the one thing, right? I could go 5 more years in this job and get involved in a critical incident. I could lose my life. I could get hit by a car tomorrow, right? Like, these adages of just what are we bringing in, and that we all have a choice. And I think for everyone that's here, it's not everyone that's like fully committed, right? But like, let's like take a vote and do what with it the best we can, because I don't truly know whether I have 2 or 20 years left in this job. That depends on so many things that I can't anticipate. But what I can control is my life and like the inputs I put into it, right? I don't know what's going to happen in my life, but I can control what I put in my body. I can control the media I consume. I can control the conversations, or what I bring to those conversations with people I love, people I work with, people I hate, people that are trolls, like whatever that is, like I have a vote. And so just trying to share those as I perceive, like, pillars of wellness, right? And that's where my podcast has grown, in Blue Grit Radio, and that's bringing in law enforcement to talk about their career and their why, their purpose, but also industry leaders like
Hmm.
such as yourself, and other health and wellness speakers, other professionals in whatever aspect of leadership, authors, right? Just we all have something to contribute, and so it's just from those conversations we can all be encouraged just to get a little bit better.
Man, I love it, and I'm so encouraged by the platforms that you've chosen to do that on. And again, like when I started to search, I found very little to nothing. In terms of in particular, how are our first responders being supported in sort of these pillars that you're talking about. And man, I'm pretty connected, like in the health and fitness, world. And it was tough. It was really tough. And what I've watched is an evolution, which has been awesome to watch in that evolution, because there's opportunity, right? There's opportunity to sell products and programs and things like that. Sometimes you're going to find charlatans. You're going to find people that are just trying to make a buck. And they generally don't last very long because, in general, most police officers would be looking to better for themselves, have a pretty good sniffer, right? And when
Mm,
they get into this stuff, they recognize pretty quick, like, oh, that was bullshit. That's pretty stinky. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And so, but they kind of come and go. But over time, what people have done, like you, is found a way to use the platform like podcasting. And as much as they can with social media, given how it can be throttled, depending on what type of content you're trying to put out there or whatever. But particularly podcasting, blog writing is still a thing. People are like, or article writing is still a thing. And
yep.
in contribution, people think that stuff's dead. It isn't dead. The most successful people I know at getting their message across use email, social media, multiple social media platforms. They use YouTube. They use all the, they're using the podcasting because it goes long form, and it's a very, very specific audience. So it's exciting when I watch guys like you do what you're doing in the way that you're doing it, because there is such a gap there and there's such an opportunity. But more exciting about that is the intention that you have behind doing it. And that, this is not something that just came up for you, and it seems like a cool thing to do because you have nothing better to do and you're trying to be famous. It's coming from a place where what you just described there was, look, it's a tough time, right? And it's a tough job. It always has been. And it's a tough time. And they're probably not going to get any easier. And a lot of people have left it because of poor attitudes or just loss of hope, or just been completely disenfranchised. And that's sad, especially when those are good cops that are leaving doing that. We've lost cops. They've been fired for not, towing the line on certain things or whatever. And that makes me sad when I look at it. But to hear what you said about those other guys that are going, you know what, like, we're still here and we're still working hard. And those are the guys that I know.
Hmm.
And, any support that they can get in any way that you can not spin it, but give the other side of what's going on inside law enforcement, particularly in your case, I think is really, really important. Again, some of my dearest friends share the exact same sentiments, and they're just as frustrated, and they haven't quite reached wit's end yet. But all of them are very positive people. That all, when I call them up or they call me, I'm like, "How you doing, man?" Like, man, I'm blessed. I just could be,
Mm,
there could be a lot of things going on, but I just, I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm doing the things that I need to do to take care of my family and myself. And it always starts like that.
yeah.
Um, and, the guys that are struggling are guys that are, have other things going on. We all have that stuff going on, other things going on, whether it's finances or, relationships or whatever else. Um, but if you entered into that problem, or already negative and already in an unhealthy, physical, psychological, or emotional state, chances of you coming out of there, anytime soon are pretty low. So the stuff that you provide is pretty cool, and I appreciate what you're doing.
No, thanks so much, man. I appreciate it too.
I wonder, so just in kind of wrapping this thing up, I could talk to you for hours, but it's just in wrapping this up. What is it that you want to do in terms of giving people information about the stuff that you're offering? Where do they go to find out more about you? Listen to all this stuff. You're turning out a boatload of podcasts. I can't believe how much density there is in the amount of podcasts you've done. You're killing it, dude. I don't know how you're doing it all, but you're doing
Thanks,
it.
man.
So tell people about it.
Early mornings, yeah, before the family wakes up, editing. No, I mean it was born out of what I thought would be helpful, right? This would be helpful for a younger me, and I think that's how a lot of us show up in the world. Is like
Hmm.
we try to appeal to like where we needed help, and so to try to I frequently in my mind frame this younger officer that, man, like if you are exposed to this information, or if I can be a mentor, even if it's like a passive mentor through social media where you're already living anyway, then hopefully I can give you something helpful, right, at
Hmm.
scale. So I can have these conversations one on one at work, or I can write about it and maybe it can hit a few more people, right? So, um, but yeah, as far as like the podcast and coaching or what have you, these are all just kind of things that I recognize I can do. And if there's the need, if someone's reaching out, then I'm here for it, right? I on my website, I put that I'm doing recruiting consultation for agencies. I kind of expected after writing a couple nationally published articles on recruiting and how much success we had, I thought people might reach out, and I've had a lot of phone conversations, right? And I'm like, hey, like, let me know if I can help. I'm not trying, like, I'm not trying to pitch myself. Like, I have a full time job. I'm trying to be here for my young daughter. I don't need the money, but I've been surprised that people are like, no, yeah, cool, sounds good. Everything you did, we're doing too. I'm like, well, clearly not, because
Yeah.
you have 20% vacancy and we're full. So,
Yeah.
hey, man, like, good though, whatever.
That's coaching 101, man. That is coaching
Yeah, and I'm
101.
just not, I'm not at that point where I've turned on the salesmanship for agencies. I'm like, hey, if something's not working, then maybe they'll come back later.
Mhm.
So I'm just trying to be where I'm needed and fill the void where I'm needed. So I'm writing for Police One. There's another publication I might start a monthly column with police. But yeah, so where they can find me, most active on Instagram, Blue Grit Wellness. It's not just health stuff, but it's spoken to a lot of the topics that I've been closest to, like recruiting. So, school resource officers, these are things that I just have a strong opinion about, that if I see it in the news, I'll comment or post about that just so people see it. Um, just police trends, right? And just where we're going as a nation society. Blue Grit Wellness, again, Instagram, bluegritwellness.com is the website, where the blog is pretty inactive because it takes a lot of time to do all these
It
things.
does,
But
man. Yeah.
yeah, otherwise the podcast is what I'm trying to rev up and keep pretty steady. It's super rewarding. I get to talk to folks like you, and every conversation just about um, is so rewarding, even for me. And I just know that so many people can get something positive from it. So that's on all the major platforms. Again, Blue Grit Radio.
I love it. It sounds great. The editing's great. You've been
Thanks, man.
going like a little bit of a shorter format for folks that are trying to get a lot of information in a quick amount of time. So your edits kind of keep the thing moving, which I really enjoyed. I don't think a lot of people do a good job with that, but there's a patterning into it. So, on the commute or in between stuff or whatever, it's a great way to kind of learn about some things and hear some different perspective and conversation. I just think, man, in the end, like I said, I really enjoy the education that you provide. It's been very helpful for me to just kind of understand things. One of the things I'm always trying to understand better are the characters within and the culture of all different types of stuff. I find that stuff to be very, very interesting, and interesting how certain characters can really influence that culture. And I really believe in what you're doing, and I appreciate it, man. So if there's anything I can do to support what you're doing, your efforts and so forth, never hesitate to ask, man. I'm here for this kind of stuff all day long. And like I said about our conversation the other day, I was really excited about this one. It's been super refreshing. Just real talk about real stuff with a real dude who really gives a shit. So, like
Yeah,
I said,
thank you,
man,
man.
thanks.
Tall praise. I appreciate it. No, and if your listeners have questions, just like stuff to ask a cop, like I'm here for it, right? So if you want to reconnect, I'm down. This was a lot of fun. I certainly get a lot from talking to you, and I appreciate the thought leadership that you provide as well.
Well, keep doing what you're doing, man. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, man.